Our next session is going to be creating Excel charts that are easy to update and reuse with Dave Paradi. A little bit about the speaker. Dave has been recognised by the media and his clients as a presentation expert. He's authored 10 books on effective PowerPoint presentations, and his ideas have appeared in publications around the world. Dave is one of fewer than 10 people in North America recognised by Microsoft with the Most Valuable Professional MVP award for his contributions to PowerPoint, Excel, and Teams communities. His articles and videos on virtual presenting have been viewed over 3.5 million times and liked over 14,000 times on YouTube. He's a highly rated conference speaker and has delivered more than 500 customized training sessions around the world in the last 23 years. And today's session is explaining how Excel charts are a key way to communicate financial analysis and results. So, without further ado, I will release Dave's video.
Hi, this is Dave Paradi of ThinkOutsideTheSlide.com, and welcome to this session on creating Excel charts that are easy to update and reuse. And you might be wondering, why is this an important topic? Well, I'm glad you've attended this session, and let me tell you why this is so important for Excel users to know. When you show a chart to an executive that illustrates an insight that you've discovered from the analysis, well, you and I both know they're going to want that updated every single month. So here's how typically things will go. You do the analysis, that takes time, and then you create the chart. That takes more time. You do that the first month. And then the next month, you have to do the analysis again, and you create the chart again from scratch, and it takes about the same amount of time. And then the third month, the same thing, the analysis, and you create the chart. Well, what I want to do is to suggest to you that you can cut the amount of time you spend every single month by using an approach that invests in building the chart differently up front. And that's what I'm going to show you in this session. See, I think we can still do the analysis. That still takes the same amount of time. But the very first month, what we do is we invest a little more time in developing that chart. And I do use that term very deliberately, invest. Yes, this is going to be a little more time than it took you to create the chart the regular way. But what happens is you're investing it so that you can save time later on. Because the next month, look at this, you save time because the updating happens so much quicker. The analysis still takes the same amount of time, of course, but the updating takes less time. And this happens not just the second month, but it happens every month after that. You're saving that same amount of time. This is why it's so important to develop a chart that's easy to update and reuse. So there's two areas that I want to focus on today. The first is structuring your worksheet and why that's important. And the second is how do you design your chart, and specifically the worksheet, so it has this flexibility. So here's an example of a worksheet that is structured in the way I suggest you look at it. Now, let's look at the different sections here. First, we have the data table. Now, this is a data table that comes in from our analysis. Maybe it's copied in, or you've got some cell references, you've linked to it. This is the data that you're getting from your analysis. Then we have helper cells. Now, helper cells can be a number of different types of cells. Sometimes they're inputs that we use. Sometimes they're intermediate calculations. Could be used for scaling, as we are in this particular example, or it could even be special characters, and we'll see that later on. Well, we use those two areas to create our chart data table. Now, the chart data table has parameters that are calculated based on the chart data. It has multiple data series. I'll explain more about this a little later. This is one of the key things that allows us to have the flexibility to deal with different types of data. Now, you're always referencing either the data table or those helper cells, or you're calculating the data series. So this is critical because this is what we use to create the chart. We create that chart data table so that the chart has the flexibility built in. So the benefit of structuring the worksheet that way is that it makes it so much easier to update and reuse. So when you have next month or next quarter's data, all you do is you simply copy the data in or refresh it if it's linked into that data table area. You don't have to do anything else because all you're doing is updating the data in that data table area. Everything else is driven from that data table area. Now, when you want to reuse the chart, let's say you have 5 regions and you need a chart for each of the regions. To reuse it, again, the way we've structured it makes this much easier than recreating a chart from scratch. All we do is we copy the worksheet, because again, the worksheet only has this one chart on it, and then we update the data. Copy it in from wherever, change the source if it's linked. Now this allows us to easily create consistent charts for each of the regions without a lot of extra effort. So let me show you what this looks like in Excel and how easy it is to update and reuse our charts when we structure the worksheet the way that I've shown you. I have a worksheet here that's showing a very common type of chart when I'm talking to my financial clients, and they're showing actual compared to the target and to the previous fiscal year. So we can see how the actual this fiscal year compares to those two standards that we want to compare to. And the way I've structured it, again, the data comes in from the analysis, and then this just came in from, so it's both hours as well as dollars. And the data table I'm using is right now just my overtime hours. And you'll see how everything gets calculated and our chart gets created. So to update this, if I wanted to change any of the numbers, it's really simple to do. Or what I could do is if I wanted to change this and say, okay, I want to see the dollars chart, not the hours chart. Very, very simple. Same sort of idea. So I'm just going to copy these cells, Control C, paste them into the cells being used, and everything updates. See how the data updated, the percentages updated, even the chart title updated. So this gives you an idea of how easy it is to update, and when you build the chart, it does all of that for you. So to reuse, let's say you said, but Dave, no, I want a separate chart. I need both of these independently. Well, that's where the reuse comes into play. So I'll undo what I did before. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this worksheet. So I'll simply copy the worksheet and say move or copy and create a copy of it. So now I have my second version of it. In the second version, now I just simply copy in the data that I want from these cells, paste it here, and I have my dollars and I have my hours. Now what I've done is I have created the exact same formatted chart and now done for dollars, the same that I have for hours, but I didn't spend a lot of time doing it. I structured the worksheet so it was easy to reuse, and I have my original and I have my new one. This is why structuring the worksheet and building the chart this way makes it so much easier to update and to reuse the chart for different measurements, different regions, different product lines, whatever it is in your specific situation. Now, one thing you may have noticed there is that the explanatory text changed as well. And that's another benefit of structuring the worksheet this way and building the chart this way, because the explanatory text is calculated and changes when the data changes. This is a great benefit because it replaces the effort that you usually go through in updating text boxes. And that unfortunate thing that happens sometimes is when you forget to update one of those text boxes on the chart. And when do you find out? When you're in front of the boss, unfortunately. By calculating it, you never have to worry because it's not you having to do the update. The Excel is doing it for you. And it allows you to create custom data labels. Custom data labels that can be positioned anywhere you want because you can create an invisible data series and position that label. This gives you that ability to customize. And you can build in directional text or symbols. So if you wanted to build in the word above or below related to a value related to a standard, you can do that because you can simply use an if statement. Symbols, up or down triangles to indicate increases or decreases. Very easy to do that when you calculate the text. So let's take a look at an example where text has been calculated and how that can help in making your charts easier to update and reuse. This is the worksheet we were just looking at, and this value here, which is the series name, and I'm using that as a data label, is a calculated and formatted formula. Let me go zoom in on the formula here and let's take a look at it. So what I want to do here in this particular field is I want to have a direction, plus or minus, and the percentage difference. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, so if it's below 0, then format the text of this calculated B16 minus C16 divided by B16, so the percentage difference, and format it with percent using 1 decimal place. That's if it's below 0, because I know the negative sign is going to be automatically included there. I don't need to deal with it separately. But if it's positive, I want the plus sign. So that's why in the second part of this formula, it says, well, if it's not below 0, then put a plus sign as a character and then add on to it that formatted percentage. That's what gives us, when we take a look at our chart here, that's what gives us the plus 2.5% and plus 22.9% in the chart, because they're being calculated. In our previous, 1 was plus and 1 was minus. We can also do this, and I'll go to our next example here. We can do the same sort of thing as a data label on an invisible series. So this is being added, similar type of graph, but it's being structured just a little differently. These are invisible data series, the diff-L and diff-R, and the labels are created, again, using a similar type of formula. And in this case, it's going to be the different types of calculations that we have for this set of data. So this is an example of how calculating your explanatory text makes it so much easier for you. You don't have to do any extra calculations, type into text boxes. Let Excel do it for you. We can extend this calculation and saving ourselves the effort to the title of the chart as well. Because we use, and I already showed you this in a preview, we use the text concatenation operator. This is that ampersand sign. And what that does is it concatenates text strings together. So we could have text in the quotes. We can also create text using that text function that you saw that I previewed already. And because we can calculate in a formula, we can add direction words, things like above or below. It allows us to add that on, just like we had the plus or minus signs in the previous example. We can also include special characters. So in addition to plus and minus, we could use these, again, directional characters with the, let's say it's an up arrow or a down arrow, an up triangle or a down triangle. This allows us to make our chart title based on the data. Again, we don't have to type it in. We can have it calculated. So let me show you an example of a chart title that's calculated based on the data in that particular chart. So we're back to one of our previous examples, and here's the chart title that's showing up at the top of the chart in this cell here. And when we take a look at the formula, it's a fairly simple formula, but it illustrates this type of technique that I was just talking about. So I'm creating the chart title by saying, okay, whatever's in A16, that's whatever the metric is we're using. And then I concatenate that with a space, the word in and another space. So again, the concatenation character doesn't add any extra spaces. If you need a space between words or between strings that you're creating, you have to add that in. Then I concatenate that with D9. D9 is what fiscal year we're in. So you see how I can copy next year's fiscal year into this particular data table, and instantly it would be updated. So this is a very simple example of how we can create the chart title based on the data. A more complex is this example here. Now this example is creating the chart title above here. And now here we're seeing these directional words, below budget, below last year. Well, those are words that have to be calculated. So when we take a look at the formula, wow, there's a lot more complex formula than we saw just before. So what I'm doing here is I'm deciding, okay, if this calculation is above 0, then we have to say above, if not below. And then we use budget and then we again do some calculations to say, is it above or below the last year calculation? And it ends up with us having a title on this chart that adjusts based on the data. So don't type in your titles all the time. Why not think about having that chart title created by Excel based on the data that you've put in? And you can include some of these directional indicators, words or symbols, to make it even more meaningful. Now you don't have to remember to update the chart title either. So you don't have to update any of the explanatory text, and you don't even have to update the chart title. This makes it a lot more flexible for you and saves you a lot more time. Now let me start talking about some of the more advanced techniques to create more flexible charts. And the first is to use this function called INDIRECT. And the structure for the INDIRECT function says INDIRECT, and then you give it some text. So if I wanted it to use the cell C6, I would put the reference text would be C6. Now initially, most people go, Dave, this is pretty useless, isn't it? If I wanted it to reference cell C6, why wouldn't I just put equal C6? Well, that's what you would do, except this indirect function, what it does is it gives us flexibility because it allows you to build the text string. This is what gives you the flexibility. You can build the text string by referencing other cells. This allows you to be able to create multiple charts simply by changing which row or which column the chart should be referencing for its data. Now you have a ton more flexibility. So again, this is about investing up front so that we build flexibility in. Now, one thing to note about this indirect function, it is what is known as a volatile function. And what that means is when you hear that term, a volatile function is recalculated every single time. And because it could be quite a complex calculation, it can make very large worksheets slow down. Now, this won't be much of a problem for you because we're talking about chart worksheets here. Remember, I'm talking about each chart is on its own worksheet. So this isn't a huge worksheet that we're dealing with thousands of rows and thousands of columns. So I need you to know that, but it shouldn't impact you when you're creating chart worksheets. So let's take a look at an example of how this indirect function can be used to create a worksheet that allows you to easily change the chart that's being shown. So this worksheet uses the indirect function to create a chart for each of our 5 regions based on this cell J4. And what I've put in J4 is what row in the worksheet should the chart use. And I've used the indirect function to say, use the input in J4 to do your calculation. So for example, if we take a look at the title here, this is a simple example here. If we take a look at what is the title, it says indirect. So it's, and again, the argument to indirect is what's the cell reference. And I know it's going to be in column A. And now I say, okay, add on to that, concatenate to that, turn J4 into a text number. No decimal places, just a regular number. So what this will build is if I have, as I've done here, row 4 is what I want to use. That's what's in J4. It'll create a formula that says equals A4, which is my region name. So it shows you how we can use this indirect function. Now, that's a simple example. We get into much more complex examples. Here we're, again, referencing whichever row we want and the column that's for, in this case, the budget number. But I showed you some more complex examples when we get into the calculating of the percentages. That's where it gets more complex. But here's how this works. If I just simply change the row number, it will change the entire chart. So instead of region 1, let's say I want to use region 5. That's row 8. I'll simply put in 8 here. And notice, everything in this chart changed. It changed the title. Again, that's calculated. I showed you that. And notice here it's above budget and below last year because it looked at the numbers. It changed the numbers. It changed the percentages. It changed the scale on the chart. Everything changed simply by changing that one cell. If I wanted to region 2, I would just put in row 5. This can make your work so much less. If all you need is these graphs as images, you don't need them to be updated in PowerPoint, for example. You could simply put in each of these row numbers, copy this chart, paste it into your PowerPoint slide for each of the regions, you're done. This can be even easier than copying the worksheet and updating the data. If you don't need a separate worksheet, you can just simply use this indirect function approach to be able to create a worksheet that is super simple to update, and everything in the chart updates from just changing one cell here. So look at the indirect function and say, how might I use this to increase the flexibility and make my charts easier to update and reuse? Probably the most important technique that I could teach in terms of making charts that are more flexible, that are easy to update and easy to reuse, is to emphasize the need to have multiple data series. Each data series only has one purpose. This means we're going to have a lot more data series, but it gives you the flexibility. One thing it also does is it makes the formulas you use a lot easier to understand. If a data series only has one purpose, we're not going to have a lot of nested ifs. We're not going to be asking, well, if it's above zero, if it's below zero, if it's exactly zero, and have a whole bunch of functions and formulas to deal with each of those situations. Instead, I would have a data series for just each of those purposes. If it's above, one data series. If it's below, another data series. If it's equal to zero, another data series. Now those formulas are so much easier to understand. This is important when you work with your colleagues and they might be updating the charts next month. They don't have to try to figure it out and hope that they figured out that formula. It's much easier for them to understand. Formatting is probably the biggest thing. When you have a single purpose for a data series, you can format it just for that single purpose. You don't have to worry about conditional formatting, because if it's always above, it's always going to be above. If you have a particular color you use for that, or a particular formatting you use for that, that's easy to apply, and it's always going to be there because it's only one purpose. You don't have to worry about conditional. Now, how is it that you could do that? Because won't everything always show up, Dave? Well, it won't if you use the NA function. The NA function puts in that NA error value into the cell, that data point. You go, why would I want an error in a data point? Because the great thing about Excel charts is when it has that NA error value, the chart does not show that data point. So any data point you don't want to appear, just give it that NA error value. This makes it so much easier to say, I don't have to worry about every data series and every data point having a value, because it doesn't have to. I can have only one purpose for each data series, and I might have most of the values in that data series might be this NA error value, because I don't need them to show up for the data that happens to be in this time period. Let me show you an example. So this is an example of a two diverging bar charts that's created as one chart. So this is just one chart. Now, when you start to think through this, let me show you the thought process and why you start to see that you need a lot of data series. So let me walk through the thought process here. So I'm planning it and I'm saying, okay, so I've got my category label, that's easy. Then I'm going to have negative bars on the left side of the first baseline and positive bars on the right side. Then I need a separator because I don't want to run the bars into each other. Then I have negative bars on the left side of the second baseline and positive bars on the right side. So that's what I want it to look like. So I think about this and I say, okay, how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to have to think about it. If the value is positive, I only want a positive bar. But that means I'm going to have to put in a spacer to take up the space of where a negative bar would have been. And I'm going to need a spacer to go between the end of the positive bar and whatever the maximum was. Similarly, if a value is negative, I'm going to want the bar on that left side. So the spacer will be small, the first spacer, but the second spacer has to take up that full area. Now you start to see, I need, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. I need 4 data series so that I can have those 2 bars positioned properly. And in fact, I end up with a lot of data series when I start to think about it. So I've got my 4 data series for the first set of bars. Then I got my spacer. Then I have another 4 data series for the second set. So I've got 9 data series just to have the bars showing. But that's not all, because I need more data series. I need series for the custom data labels. I want to be able to show those custom data labels with the formatting, whether it's dollars, whether it's percentages, whatever the formatting is, whether I want the pluses, the minuses, however that is, I want to control that formatting, especially with the negative ones. A negative bar actually has a positive value in a stacked bar chart. Well, it has to because it goes from left to right. But you need a label that says this is a negative value. That means you're going to need a custom data label. And then I also need the baselines. Those baselines need to be drawn in the correct spot. So I'm going to need data series to be able to do that, and the headers. I do all of that using scatter with straight line data series. So this starts to become a lot of data series. And that might seem a little overwhelming at the start, and I get that, and that's okay. But like I said, take it one data series at a time. Because the data series only represents one particular purpose, it's much easier to think through this. Now let me show you what this actual worksheet looks like for that particular visual. So here's the worksheet from that visual. I have my data table, as we talked about. I have some helper cells, which is helping me do the calculations. And then I have my chart data table. The chart data table here, when you are using spacers, you need to figure out how big does that spacer plus visible bar need to be. And here's where I use this formula, and it leverages a function which some people haven't used before called ceiling.math. Ceiling.math is a great function. What it does is it rounds up a value to a particular segment size that you want. And so here you notice our formula here says use the absolute value, because again, I need it to be positive. This is dealing with the negative values in this particular data set. So absolute value of the minimum, what's the biggest negative number, multiply that by G5. So G5 is my scaling value. Here's where these input parameters are really helpful, because I can decide how much bigger. Usually I go about 10% bigger, just because I need an extra space. I don't want things to run into each other. And then, what's the segment size? G4, that's the second argument in this particular function. So the segment size here I've set to 200,000. This again gives me flexibility. If I wanted to reuse this particular worksheet for a set of data that was only in the hundreds, instead of the hundreds of thousands or millions, I would simply just change the input in G4 and it would automatically work properly. This is the value of having these helper cells that you input. It gives you that flexibility to deal with data that is of a totally different order of magnitude. The ceiling.math formula, that function and the formula that I create there, allows me to have a knowledge of, okay, the total is going to be, in this case, 2.6 million. Now my formulas here are simply saying, when I take a look at the formula, if this is greater than or equal to 0, then use the full spacer. If not, then it's the spacer plus the value. Now, because the value is negative, it actually reduces the size, right? So we're thinking about that and dealing with it. Now, if I move to my next formula here, this is now calculating the size of the visible segment, the negative segment. What if it's not a negative segment? What if it's a positive segment? Here's where that NA value comes in. So take a look at the formula. If B5 is less than 0, which means it's negative, okay, then we use the absolute value. But if it's equal to or greater than 0, what do? We use the NA function. The NA function doesn't take any parameters. That's why it's just the brackets there. But what it does is it puts in that cell, you'll notice for this one is a positive. So in this one, it puts in that £, n/a error value. Now, again, this is where it gets confusing for some people when they first look at it, because they're like, why would I want an error value there? Because it won't show up in the chart. So that's how all of these particular data series are calculated. Here are the data series for the labels Again, the labels are calculated based on if this value really needs to be there, then have a label. If not, then just make it blank. This means that we can assign labels to every single one of these bar segments, and if that bar segment isn't there, then it's just a blank label anyways. Nobody sees it. And then here's where we have our baselines, our scatter with straight lines that allow us to have the baselines. And then here are the custom labels, which position it above the two diverging bar charts. So this is where you start to see the power of thinking through and planning out your visuals and planning out what are all the different purposes that I need, and then having a data series for each and every one of those purposes. This is probably the biggest skill to learn that will allow you to create these charts that are super flexible, deal with any sort of data and changes, because it's all driven from the calculations where the chart's figuring out, in this case, which side should the segment be on, whether it's negative or whether it's positive. Another really great technique to know about is to know about chart filtering. What chart filtering does is it allows you to create a chart with many more categories than you need and only show the ones you want. So one of the things with charts is if you build a chart and then you realize, oh, I need more categories, let's say more rows in a chart or more columns in the chart, adding that on afterwards can sometimes be difficult. This technique doesn't make you do that. What you do is you build in all the categories you think you might need from the start. And then you use the chart filter skill. The chart filter skill is one that I find a lot of people don't know about or don't use as well as they could. What this does is it allows you to tell Excel, hey, only use these categories for the chart, and then the chart automatically updates and adjusts. Let's take a look at how this works for a simple example of a column chart. Here's our simple example, and in this example, let's say we are showing monthly sales. And of course, as the months go on, we will have those numbers, but we don't have all of them at the start. If we want to show just this year's numbers, we could create a new chart every month, adding another month on to the chart, and then having to create the chart. Or we can create a chart that has all of the numbers at the start, all of the months there. And but Dave, I have all these zeros showing. You do, except here's where that chart filter skill comes into play. When I select my chart, the skittles are what's on the right-hand side here. This one that looks like a funnel is the chart filter skittle. When I click on it, what it does is it allows me to select either series or categories which I want shown. Now, by default, as you can see here, I'll zoom in. As you can see, by default, all of them are selected. Well, that makes sense. That's what we would expect. But you'll notice it gives us the ability to select the ones we want. So I can uncheck select all for the categories and say I just want, how many? Oh, January, February, March, and April. And then I'll go down and click apply. And when I click apply, what does it do? It shows me just the chart with those categories. You don't even know that there are more categories in this chart. But I'm showing you only ones that I need to show you now. Next month, let's say we get May's figures in and they're 255. Now you'll notice the chart data table, because it's just simply drawing the numbers from the data table above. It includes it, but my chart doesn't. Well, no problem. I select the chart. I go to the filter skill. I say, oh, I want to show May now. Click apply, and automatically I'm seeing May in that chart. So using the filter in a chart allows you to create a chart from the beginning that includes all of the possible categories you want. And then you can decide which ones you show in the chart. This again gives you a lot of flexibility to reuse a chart for a different number of categories. Doesn't matter because you've already built that in when you built it the first time. So let me bring this all together and show you how I apply a lot of the techniques and ideas that I've shown you in this session to building a waterfall chart that is easy to reuse, easy to adapt to different sets of data. So let's hop over to Excel and let me build this waterfall chart, and you'll see how a lot of these techniques I've shown you come together. So here's my worksheet that I've started to set up for my waterfall chart. What I've done here, this is the data that I have. I have a Q1 forecast and then some different things that have happened that explain the difference between the Q1 forecast and the Q1 actual. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a couple of helper cells. I'm going to use some symbols, add those into the data labels. So I want to put those helper cell symbols here so I can just reference the cell. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a upward pointing and a downward pointing triangle to indicate increases and decreases. I'm going to use symbols, so I'm going to go to my insert ribbon. I'm going to go to symbol, and I'm going to select my symbols here. So I use these often, that's why it's in the recently used symbols. So I'm going to select this one here. I'm using, and I'll just zoom in so you can see this easier. So I'm using the Segoe UI symbol character set, and I'm in a geometric shapes, and I like this upward pointing and downward pointing triangles that are filled. So that's the ones that I'm using here. So the first one I'm going to use is my upward, because that's the positive. So you'll notice it's black up pointing triangle. There's the character code 25B2. I'm going to insert that. And then I have to close the dialog to go to the next cell. And I'll do the same thing, go to the symbols, and this one I'm going to be the downward pointing triangle. Insert that and close. Okay, now I have my helper cells set up. Now I come to my chart data table. So my chart data table, I have, again, thought through. Each data series only has one purpose. So I'm going to have a data series for a spacer. So to create a waterfall chart, I use a stacked column chart because it's a better technique to use than the built-in waterfall chart. So I'm going to have, for every segment that's floating up above, I'm going to have a spacer segment invisible down below that's supporting it. And that's how you create segments that seem to float in midair. They're not floating, they're just supported by something that's invisible. That invisible segment is the spacer segment. Then I have, what if it's positive? So I could format the positive, the increases one way. What if it's negative? Format those. And what if it's start or end? Because I want those separate as well. Now, I set this chart data table up to have not just the number of explanatory segments that this particular waterfall chart has. I set it up so I have many more. I've referenced Q1 forecast, etc., etc. But then I have all these empty ones. So if next time I reuse this, I've got 6 segments instead of 4 here, explanatory, no problem. I've already built this in, so it works. And all the formulas will work that way as well. And then my end is where I say, here's the actual value. So I've built in all these extra ones. Now I'm going to simply build the formulas for each of these. So the spacer segment, well, how big does it need to be? Well, it depends on whether it's a start or end. If it's start or end, I don't have a spacer. So the formulas are going to be a little different, but I know that because it's start or end. So my first one, I know that's the start, so I'm going to simply say, okay, so equals my starting value. And similarly for the end, I can do that one as well, equals the ending value. Okay, that makes it simple. Now, my spacer for the next segment, where's it going to be? Where's the bottom of that segment? Well, I have to calculate that. So it's going to be equal to the previous spacer, which is going to be, in this case, none, but I do need to build this formula. So it's going to be equals the previous spacer, and then I'm going to add on to it any positive from that previous, add on to it any start or end from that previous, and then I'm going to subtract the negative value that is for this particular row. So this is how we calculate the spacer. So I'm going to put that in. Now I need to calculate the positive. Now, remember, each data series is only one purpose. So this is only if the difference is positive. So I'm going to use an if statement here. So if the value here is greater than 0, then use that value. If not, here's where my NA error function comes in, because I don't want there to be a segment. It's not positive. And in this case, it's not. So it shows that. Now, what if it's negative? So again, equals if my value here is below 0, then I need the absolute value, because a stacked column, again, it has to be a positive value. So I'm going to use the absolute value of B5. And if not, then I have my NA error value. And we notice the spacer updated because it now has that negative value. So what I can do is I can now copy these formulas for all of the rest of the segments. And I can just eliminate it for the ones that I'm not using. If I had all of them, obviously I can just copy all these values down. The reason you don't want to keep copying it down is because, as you saw, it picks up the end value if it was there. So now I've got all of this set up. And why is this an error? Okay, so if you're going to use the NA error value, that's where you need to use, when you're using any formulas, you have to use if NA. If NA is a function that says, if it's an NA error value, what do you want to use instead? So when I calculated the spacer, it was fine. But when I calculate the next spacer, it says, okay, add C17, which is NA, and it gives me the NA error value. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to adjust this formula. And I'll go up to adjust the formula. And I'm going to zoom in so you can see me do this here. So B16 plus, not C16, because if that's an NA, I don't want that to be used. So I'm going to use if NA. And what if NA says is the value, if that value is NA, what do you want it to use? And in this case, I want it to use 0. And the same with my D17, if NA, then use 0. Okay, now, let's see if that formula is going to give me what I want. And indeed, now it gives me exactly what I want. So, when you're using the NA error value, you have to use if NA to do any calculations. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So I've got my formulas now for my various segments, and now I just need to create the labels. The labels is where I'm going to be using these helper cells that I created. So the positive and negative labels, I don't need labels for the start and the end because those are separate. So I can say, so I'm going to use my if here, if the value here is greater than 0, so if it's positive, then how do I want this formatted? Well, I want to use that upward triangle and then format the number. So I'm going to say, okay, so if it's positive, then I want G4, and I'm going to concatenate. So it's not a plus sign, it's that text concatenation operator, the ampersand. And then I'm going to use the text function to format the number. So the text of B5, and the formatting I want here, let's say, is I want to have, and this is using the number formatting in Excel. So I'm going to have comma, I want to have, and I do want a 0 if it is 0, and that, and that's all. And if it's not greater than 0, then what I want is I want to have null. So just two of the quotes right beside each other, because I don't want there to be a label there at all. And indeed, because this one, there isn't anything there, then it doesn't show anything. But when I copy it down, for the two that are positive, I have that. Now, why didn't the arrow show up? Again, here's where I have to go and say, no. G4, I have to have the lock it in. So I have to have the dollar signs there. Let's see. Yeah, now we've got it. Okay, so similarly for the negative, my if the value is below 0, then I want G5. Let's lock that in first, and a percent. Now here I can decide. If it's negative, do I want it to be negative? No, I don't, because I've already used this directional symbol. So think about how you want it formatted. So here I'm going to say text, and here I'm going to say I want the absolute value of B5, because I don't want the negative sign in there. And then I'm going to use the same number format as I did before. And again, if it isn't negative, then I want nothing there. And let's see. There we go. So I've now formatted my data labels. And again, if I had more of the segments, I would just copy these formulas down. Now I can select all of the categories. There are blank ones there, but remember, I'm going to use the filter. That's what I'm going to use. So now I'm going to insert my stacked column chart. I'm going to move it down so that we can actually see it a little better here. Let's move this so it's easier for you to see. I can make my, let's say my beginning and ending columns in the format. I'm going to make those the blue. I'm going to turn the spacer one to be invisible, just set that to no fill. The ones that are negative, I'm going to set those to be the light orange, and the positive ones, I'm going to set those to be the light green. And then I'm going to add data labels. So let's make these bigger. So I'll just go to the formatting task pane and set the gap width, let's say to 40% here. Makes them a little wider. So now I need to add my data labels. So these are the negative values. So I'm going to add data labels, and I'm going to go to more options. And I'm going to say I want value from cells. Now notice I need to select all of the rows that are in the data table, even the ones I'm not using, the chart data table. So I'm going to select all of these, say OK, and I'm going to say I don't need the value because I've already got that in the symbol. So I do the same thing for my positive ones, add the data labels there from the cells. This is why I created these custom data labels, so that I could use them in the chart, and I don't need the value there either. Now I could add the data labels for my starting and ending series as well. Here I don't need to add any extra. I can just use the values themselves, put it at the inside of the end, and I can format those. Let's say I want them to be a number format, 0 decimal places, I don't need that. And I can set the font to be white so we can see them. So I've got all of that set up. Now I just use my filter. So I can say, okay, in the categories, I don't want the ones that don't have anything in them. Uncheck those, say apply. I don't need my legend, of course. That doesn't make any sense. I'm going to get rid of the chart title and the grid lines as well, so you see this nice and clear. So what I've done is I have now created this chart, which is flexible. If the numbers change, all of this changes. So for example, if shipment delays wasn't minus 4,200, let's say it was plus 1,400. I change that in the data table that comes in. Notice how everything in the chart data table changes, and everything down here in the chart changes as well. So when the data updates, it automatically updates. If I want to reuse it, I've built that flexibility in by having additional categories. If I want to reuse it by simply copying it, and if it has the same number of categories, I just copy that information into the data table, and instantly it's updated. This is the value of using these techniques and these approaches that I've taught you in this session to create charts that are easy to update and reuse. It can save you a ton of time if you just invest some time up front in creating charts that are easy to update and reuse. Thanks for attending this session at the Excel Virtually Global 2022 conference. Attend more sessions, learn more. Use what you've learned in this session to create charts that are easy to update and reuse. You can take out your mobile device, you can scan the QR code you see on your screen right now, and I set up a special page for you that has additional resources with some more details behind some of the ideas that I shared with you in this session. Use that to further your learning. Thanks for attending. If you have questions, I'm available in the chat right now, and I'm happy to answer those questions. Thanks again.
Well, thanks for that, Dave. I can put you on as a presenter now, so if you'd like to turn your camera on, we can put you live.
There we go.
Okay, we'll just send you live now. Just sending you live now. Just give it a couple of seconds to catch up with us. There we go. You're on screen now. Well, that was a great presentation. Thank you. I guess you are the king of presentations.
Pardon me?
I guess you are the king of presentations, so we should expect it. It was very good. So there was a lot of waterfall charts in there, I noticed, very flexible ones. Is there any charts that you would recommend people don't use in presentations?
The key thing that I always ask people is, what message are you trying to communicate? And select your chart based on that message. And that's the one place that I find people struggle with. They've seen a chart and they go, oh, well, I'll always use that chart, not realizing that chart communicates a message. So think about your analysis and what message am I trying to communicate? So for example, if you're trying to compare values to each other, where the values are important and people need to see the difference between those values, some people will choose, well, I always use a line chart. I'm going to suggest you maybe choose a column chart instead. A line chart is better for trends, where the comparison, usually over time, the comparison of the values is the important message, not the comparison of the individual values. It's the trend over time. So it's important that people think about the message. Where I see charts that are confusing, it's usually because the wrong message has been chosen. And I know sometimes you're going to hear from people to say, and there's this statement that goes out in DAVE world that says, you should never use pie charts.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
I don't believe that that's true. What I find is a lot of people get challenged because a pie chart is used for the wrong message. Here's the thing. Many people use pie charts to communicate a comparison of values to each other. Now, when you do that, you are asking people to compare wedge sizes or arc lengths on the fly in their head.
Mm-hmm.
People can't do it. They can't. So instead, most pie charts are sorted largest wedge down to smallest wedge. So most of those pie charts should be bar charts, where we order it from longest bar to shortest bar. But that doesn't mean you should never use a pie chart. If you're trying to show one segment compared to a total, that's where a pie chart, I think, is a good visual to use.
Yeah. Then you can pull the segments out as well, just to emphasize. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even our pie or donut charts, these can be created with the flexibility using some of the ideas that I showed in this session. So for example, on Sunday, I'm going to be doing a session at a conference in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And one of the things I'm going to be showing them is how you can have the percentage and related text for a donut chart in the middle of the donut chart. And it is driven by cells. So when you say, okay, I don't want to use row 5, I want to use row 6 to create this donut chart, that percentage and that text automatically update. So it is something that you can still use the techniques that I shared in this session to make your pie or donut charts easier to update and reuse.
That's pretty cool. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed your session. That was great. Dave, anything you'd like to add at all? Any sort of links that you'd like to share? Then feel free. Any plugs for what you're doing?
Yeah, a lot of what I do is to help corporate organizations, usually people who have to deal with financial data or operational data, and to make their reporting to executives more effective. One of the biggest challenges people have in presenting to executives is they take spreadsheets of data, or increasingly they'll take a Power BI massive dashboard and copy it onto a slide.
Yeah.
And here's the biggest problem when you copy a spreadsheet onto a slide. For those of you who unfortunately are seeing that, and you've seen this in meetings, I know you've seen it, because what happens is an executive will find some number in the lower corner, a number that has nothing to do with the key message, but they go dog on a bone on that one number. And you're 15 minutes off a place you have no business being. And the key message you wanted those executives to understand and you wanted them to act on gets lost.
Okay, that's good advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the sessions and catch up with any of them that you didn't get a chance to attend live by getting the videos when those are posted. Thanks again to the whole Some Product team for organizing this, for keeping us all on track as presenters, and I look forward to the next conference in 2023. Thanks, everybody.
Right,
have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Dave. Bye. Okay, so that's the evaluation slide for Dave. If you'd like to either use the bit.ly link underneath or use the QR code. In fact, you can put comments in about any of our presenters on there. They're all on the form.